This presentation on pesticide resistance management by Catherine Gantus and Hilary Sandler from the UMass Amherst Cranberry Station and Laura McDermott from Cornell University was made possible by funding from Northeast SARE Professional Development Program. With special thanks to Margaret McGrath, Andrea Loikin, and Richard Bonanno for their assistance and expertise. What is pesticide resistance? It is an inheritable genetic characteristic of a pest that makes it less sensitive to a pesticide. It can occur in all types of pests, weeds, insect, fungi, etc. The pest is able to survive a pesticide exposure that would kill those individuals that did not have those genes. The genes naturally occur in the pest population. The pesticide does not create a mutation, does not cause these genes to occur. They are already present in the population of pests. What happens is that the pesticide use will select for resistance. It does that by killing susceptible individuals or those without the genes, and those with the genes are able to survive. They are selected by the pesticide exposure. Pests with the gene will live, reproduce, pass on the genes for resistance to their offspring. The resulting pest population will have increasing numbers of resistant individuals. In this natural pest population, there are some individuals that have the genes that make them less sensitive to the pesticide. In this case, insects, the red ones, have the naturally occurring genes. A pesticide application occurs, and what happens is that the individuals that are susceptible will die, in this case most of them, and a few that have the resistant genes will survive the application. The individuals with the naturally occurring genes that make them less sensitive to the pesticide will survive. And after the pesticide application, after the humans have applied this type of selection pressure to the population, the less sensitive pests that have survived will reproduce, and the resulting offspring will have the genes that make them resistant to the pesticide. This does not happen in a single application. Resistance takes time to develop. So even if on your particular farm situation you have a lot of resistant individuals, there are much more populations of these pests that occur outside of your farm as well. And there's a lot of flow of individuals between off-farm populations onto your farm, which is good. So you have a constant influx of genes that stop this population from being entirely resistant. However, on the converse side, there's also a flow of genes from your farm into the native populations. After time, as I said, resistance takes time to develop. If there's enough pesticide exposures on your farm, there's enough of the selection pressure applied again and again over time, the individuals will enter the wild populations, and over time, resistance will become more widespread. Because resistance takes time to develop, it gives us an opportunity to use techniques that can forestall or delay or even prevent the development of widespread resistance. If an insect population is resistant to a particular pesticide, in this case the green spray at the top, that pest will likely not be resistant to other types of pesticides that are not within that same group. So by rotating between pesticides, what happens is that you can remove some of the individuals that are resistant to the first pesticide from the population with an application of the second pesticide. We have seen resistance develop in the cranberry industry already. We have two particular poignant cases of this. The first is weevil. So this pest of cranberry is now resistant to all organophosphates, and the resulting pesticide that we use to control it, Avant, we are now worried that it's developing resistance to Avant. Spag is another example of a cranberry pest that is now resistant to organophosphates, and that we have a worry that it might be developing resistance to Delegate, which is the pesticide that is now used to control this pest. An example of weed resistance, a good example of this is when we look at Roundup Ready systems. In this case, we'll talk about the soybean system. Agricultural scientists have created soy plants that are unaffected by glyphosate exposures. What this means is that soy growers could then spray glyphosate over the top of their crop and kill all of the weeds in the field, leaving their crop uninjured. This really simplified weed management. It was a great tool when it first appeared on the scene. However, increasing glyphosate use, both the frequency and the large number of acres treated, have increased the probability of selecting herbicide resistance plants. Here's a picture of a soybean field after a glyphosate application. The weed here is horseweed. You can see here that a lot of the horseweed has died off, these brown desiccated individual horseweed plants, but you can see that there are also quite a few number of horseweed plants that have escaped this glyphosate exposure and have survived. What happens now over time is that glyphosate-resistant horseweed now infests millions of acres from Delaware to Illinois. In addition to horseweed, there are lots of other weeds that are also becoming resistant to glyphosate: pigweed or amaranth, ragweed, and many others as well. So why is managing resistance important? Well, pesticide resistance is increasing. Currently, there are at least 520 insects and mite species, and of these, 17 insect species are resistant to all major classes of insecticides, not just one. There are over 273 documented weed species, 150 plant diseases, and 10 rodent species that have some type of pesticide resistance documented. There are likely many more that we are not aware of yet. So why is managing resistance important? Well, we need pesticides to provide effective control of pests. We use pesticides because we need to control pests. New products for pest control are very hard to develop. And if the current technology that we have available to growers stops working, it might be a very long time until something comes along to replace it. We also need to practice good environmental stewardship. Pests are mobile, and resistance that develops in one crop or one area can easily spread to other crops or other areas. And again, if we're using ineffective pesticides, we're causing unnecessary risk. So every pesticide use is associated with some type of risk, both to the human who's applying it, the environment, and so on. And we take these risks because we deem them worthy. However, if our pesticides are not working, then we're taking these risks unnecessarily. As I mentioned, all types of pests and all types of pesticides are at risk for resistance. Herbicides, fungicides, and insecticides. Each one of these types of pesticides has has a resistance action committee that's been developed. And these are international groups that are founded by the agrochemical industry for a cooperative approach to resistance management. They're excellent sources for information and education materials related to each class of pesticide. The mode of action is the chemical structure of a pesticide that defines the target site, which is the physical location within an organism where the pesticide acts. The mode of action is the action of a pesticide at its target site, the way in which it causes a physiological disruption at the target site. Each pesticide has a group number that was assigned to it by the resistance action committees for that type of pesticide. And these group numbers help growers make resistance management decisions. The group number should be clearly marked on all pesticide labels. Herbicides have two separate groupings. One's assigned by the Herbicide Resistance Action Committee and one's assigned by the Weed Science Society of America. The HRAC will use letters and the WSSA will use numbers for their codes. They're very, very similar, slightly different, but in most cases, they will be in alignment with one another. So you can see here, I have an example of a label from Select Max, which is a clethodim product. Right on the top of the label, it will say it's a Group 1 herbicide. If you then go and look at the information about what this means, in this case, Group 1, it will tell you the site of action, it will tell you the chemical family, and it will tell you other active ingredients that are within this same group. The same is true for insecticides. They all have a code that's been assigned by the Insecticide Resistance Action Committee. Here is a label for Lorsban. Right at the top of the label, it tells you it's a Group 1B insecticide. If we then go look at the Insecticide Resistance Action Committee website, we can learn from that 1B is an organophosphate, and it will give you a large number of other pesticides that are within this same group. Same is true for fungicides. The Fungicide Resistance Action Committee code clearly marked at the top of this label for a product called Abound, Group 11. In addition to the group numbers, labels also have a lot of good information about resistance management. Sometimes there's recommendations on the number of fungicides, the sprays, and other types of things that one can rotate to. So I urge you to consult the label for your pesticide to look for this type of information when making a plan for your farm. In cranberry management, we put out a publication called the Cranberry Chart Book every year. And in this particular publication, we have detailed information about the different groups and the risk of developing of resistance. What we can use these numbers and these groupings to do is to help us alternate, rotate, or sequence different pesticides to help forestall resistance management. By using the codes when you're choosing your material, now you have to use the codes. It's very important. You can't rely on product names or active ingredients because many different products and active ingredients can be in the same group. In this case here, if you were only looking at the product names to plan a rotation or a sequence, and you're saying, I'm using Aftershock and then I'm using Avito, I'm using two different products. In actuality, these two products are both group 11 fungicides. So this is not a good rotation. They're within the same group. If you were only looking at the active ingredients to plan your rotation or sequence, and you're saying, oh, these two products have two different types of active ingredients, if I alternate or rotate between these two, then perhaps I'm doing a good rotation or sequence. But in truth, these are both group 3 fungicides, so this is not a good rotation or sequence. You want to look at the group numbers to plan your sequences. So to plan a true rotation or sequence, you would want to move between 11, 3, 19, and so on. So again, you really need to be using these numbers, not the names and not the active ingredients when you're planning rotations or sequences for pesticide resistance management. In addition to choosing chemicals from different groups, applications must be timed correctly. You really should be targeting the most vulnerable life stage of the pest, and you should be using spray rates and application intervals that are recommended by the manufacturer and that are in compliance with local agricultural extension regulations. A high rate may possibly take out pests that might be somewhat resistant, but if you're using a rate that's too low, it may allow the resistant individuals to survive and reproduce. So rate selection is very important. There are many challenges to managing resistance. Some products with resistance risk for one pest are also used for another. Pesticides don't only work on the target that you're targeting. You have a large ecosystem in your field, so even if you're targeting, in this case, you're using delegate to control black-headed fireworm and cranberry, you're also exposing the spag and the other bugs that may be present on your farm, but that are below the action threshold and you're not necessarily targeting. Some key points about managing resistance. The goal is delaying the development of resistance, not managing resistant pest biotypes once they are detected. So once resistance exists, it's more difficult to manage than it is to use good practices to avoid the development of resistance in the first place. You should always be using integrated pest management programs on your farm, and you should, when at all possible, minimize the use of at-risk products. When we look here, again, this is an example from the Cranberry Chart Book, but this type of information is likely available for other crops as well. You have, in addition to information about the group number, the trade name, the mode of action, and the chemical group, you also have some information about the risk of development of resistance. So some chemicals are as high risk and others are lower risk. So when at all possible, choose a lower risk product. And you should not be relying on pesticides alone. It's important that you integrate different controls into your management programs. In addition to synthetic pesticides, there's biological pesticides, there's beneficial insects, there are cultural practices for weeds, you can do hand weeding and so forth, and there are chemical attractants and deterrents that can be used. So by implementing all of these tools together, you have a program that is less susceptible to developing resistance to developing resistance to pesticides. Thank you for your time.